Thank you again to Kelly for this challenge and to Emma for validating it. It was definitely pretty tricky this week, right? So we've got this data here from our distribution centres and all the information about each month and which employees were working there, etc. So our first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use an aggregate step, and we're just going to keep the distribution number, the employee ID. We want to know what month they started in, and I've changed this to be a start of the month. So this is actually only something that I discovered really recently, is when you're grouping a date in Tableau Prep, you have this group by level option, so we can do the month start there. So we're grouping by the month start for higher date, so you can see how that's always made the day value be 1. It's like doing a date trunk. There. And then we're taking their maximum leave date. So that means that if they have a leave date, that will populate. If they don't have a leave date, that will be null. Because at the moment the leave date only appears in the row that they actually leave within. So we're taking the maximum value so that we get information about all the employees that work there at the distribution centre, and basically the start and end of when they work there. So to then fill in all the rows in between that, and make sure that we definitely have a row for each employee for each month that they have been employed by the company, then we are going to use this scaffolding approach to get a row for every month. But in order to do that the most effectively, we want that to be from the first of the month each time, rather than working with the end of the month. It just makes it slightly easier when working with the new row step. So if you think about it, if we have the 30th of the month, then when we get to February, we don't have the 30th, so it goes to the 28th, and then from there it'll always go to the 28th. It's just be a bit more consistent. We'll keep everything to the first of the month because everything has a first of the month. So we will we'll create a field called the leave date start month, so that we have a roll that back to the start of the month. So just do a date trunk on the leave date for the month. So this is kind of an identical field, but just without the day information in it. And then we'll replace these nulls with the last month in the data set, which we're told is June 2023. So we just say that if our leave date is null, then make it be the 6th of June. The 1st of June 2023. Cool. So now those nulls are filled in. So now we're ready to go into that new row step, having our hire date and our leave date start of month as our lower and upper bounds. We're creating a new field called month, and we're making sure we specified our increment to be a month, and we're copying the values from the previous row for those new rows that we create. So for example, for this employee here, we can see they start in April, finish in November, and so we get a row for every single month in between April and November, which is great. Cool. So now we can start thinking about doing a count for our number of employees in a particular month, or our number of employees who left in a particular month. So we'll start off with those who have left first. So our first calculation is looking at if we need to update this leave date start of the month again. So we're making those rows where we had a null leave date to be null again, and otherwise stay the same. So basically updating it so it matches the leave date again, but it's still at the first of the month, at the start of the month. And that's because when we then create the leave date leaving fields, then we're checking if that leave date start of the month is equal to the month, because that's always on the first of the month as well. So we're giving it a 1 if they're equal and a 0 if not. So hopefully that makes sense why we're using the leave date start of the month rather than the leave date itself, because we want the day part to match up as well. We could do some, month aggregations rather than doing this calculated field. I just thought this would be the easier way around. And then we're looking to update our month field, so this one that we've got here, and we're going to make it the month end date now instead. So now we're making that match what it looked like at the start of this workflow. So we're getting our month end date rather than the start of the month. So basically the way to do that is to make sure that we add on 1 month to our month field. So January would become February, the 1st of February, and then we minus 1 day from it. So then that would become the 31st of January. So nice and simple there. So that's what we're doing. Now we can create the count. So we're saying if our leave date is null, or our leave date, the one that has the daily information, is after the month end date, then we give it a 1, else we give it a 0. So we've got those two fields there, counting how many employees we have in each month and counting how many employees left in that particular month. Okay, and then we're just removing a lot of the unnecessary fields. It's kind of an unnecessary step because we're going straight into an aggregate step, I realise now. But I was, by this point in the workflow, being like, okay, I just need to declutter, get rid of the fields that I don't need. So I'm left with just the distribution centre number, the month end date, the E count, the E leaving, and the employee ID. But now we're going to aggregate, where we leave behind our employee ID, so we go to the distribution center level, we group by the month end date as well, so I get a row for each distribution center and a row for each month. You know what I mean? A row for each month and each distribution center, and I'm just summing up that E count and E leaving fields. Okay, so now, before we go into those calculations that Kelly lists in the challenge, we want to make sure that we have a complete data set, so that we have a row for every single month that a distribution center is open. So we're going to make sure that we have that first of all, before we go on to calculating those calculations. So we're going to duplicate that month end date field, and we're just going to rename it to be min and max, so that we can aggregate this to be for each distribution center, the minimum month that we have in the data set and the maximum month that we have in the data set. So that's what we do here. And then we just, again, roll it back to the start of the month like we did before, create those new rows so that we have between the min and the max, naming it month, and then creating that end of the month. So very similar to the process we went through before, so that we know for each distribution center and each month we have a row present. Now, the interesting thing about this workflow is that actually we keep the same number of rows, so 315 rows here and 315 rows here. So our data was already complete, but it's really important that we go and verify that before going into multi-row calculations, basically, or row calculations that work across multiple rows, because otherwise you might accidentally have a gap that you didn't notice. So for example, if I had data for January and for March, then if I just went straight to the multi-row calculations, then I might be comparing my number of employees in March to the number of employees in January, rather than it being the prior month that was supposed to be February. So it's important that we make sure we validate that and verify it, and then we join the data sets back together. So we want it to be a right join in this case to keep all of these months that we've just scaffolded out, but we're joining on the distribution center and the month end date. Okay, and then similar to that, we're making sure that if this were a data set where we had missing rows, that E count and the E leaving was 0 if we didn't have a row for that month. Okay, but now we're ready to go on to the calculations. So there's quite a few in this step, so let's go through them step by step. So first of all, we want to know the E count for the prior month, and this is where our lookup function comes in. So lookup is available from 2023.2, and it looks very similar to some of the other analytical calculations. So we're doing a partition or a group by on the distribution center, and we're ordering by the month end date in an ascending order, and we're using the lookup function to look up the previous row, so -1, E count. So as we can see here, if we look at the second row, for example, then May, we get the value for the E count value for April in the same row now as May. Okay, and then we can do a similar thing for the 12-month prior. We just literally have this exact same calculation, but we're doing a -12 this time instead in our lookup. And then we can go and validate and see if that worked by looking, say, at April here, which had that 9 E count. If we go down to April the following year, then we can see that we get that 9 E count there again. So that's working too. Next, it's just some simple averaging. So we're averaging the E month, so we're just doing the E count PM plus the E count divided by 2 to 6 decimal places. And similarly for the average E P12, we're just using the P12 here instead of the PM. And then for the levers, we want to actually have kind of like a rolling 12-month sum. So what we do here is we're using a moving calculation. The way that we get this visual editor to appear is you would come to the leaving field and you would go to the drop down here, create a calculated field, moving calculation, and then that will pop up this visual editor that we can see here. We want to make sure that we're grouping by the distribution center, we're ordering by the month end date in ascending order, and we are summing those values as it's a moving sum, and we're doing the 11 previous values as well as the current value, so you can see it's including 12 in there. Wonderful. And then we're finally ready to get to that turnover calculation. So for turnover, it's simply that we're rounding the E leaving divided by the average E month times by 100, so that we get that as kind of like a percentage. And we're rounding that to 2 decimal places, and then for the turnover P12, we're using just the P12 values in that. So, whew, that was quite a lot of calculations, quite a lot of reshaping our data. It was a really good challenge to go through. I've just removed a couple of extra fields that we didn't need here before I'm outputting that data. I really hope that you enjoyed that challenge, and thank you very much for watching.